Welcome, everyone. So glad to have you joining me today. My name is Cyndy McDonald, and I am the hostess, the producer. I'm also a college counselor, an entrepreneur. I'm like many of you. I wear lots of hats. And I'm so glad to have with me today a team of experts in the area of college and higher education, youth, and we're going to have a great conversation about what it takes to help students to be supported as they transition from high school into college. And as you're joining us today, please put your name and your location so that our guests can see where you're coming from. And I encourage you to have those conversations also as we go through the Friday Forum. Friday Forums is something that I started during COVID and thought, oh, it'll just take a week or two, a month or two. And here we are 4 years later, and we're still going strong. Thanks to you. Thanks to my audience and everybody that's interested in learning more how we can help support the families that we serve and the students that we serve. So welcome, everyone. And I want to say welcome to my guest, to Christine Bowman from Southwestern University, to Cathy Finks from the College of Wooster, and Marano, who is the Executive Director for Colleges That Change Lives, and to Lauren Sefton, who is from Rhodes College. And I'll let each one of them introduce themselves to you a little bit, and they can tell you about their roles in their universities and colleges as well. And we have Carmen, who is my producer, and she is the one that helps keep us all straight and will track questions and things, because I'm sure we'll have questions for today. So welcome, everybody, and welcome to the Friday Forum. So to get started, let's go ahead and do a little round of introductions. Christine, we'll start with you. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your role and the college that you serve.
Absolutely. My name's Christine Bowman. I'm the Assistant Vice President of Admission at Southwestern University, which is located in Georgetown, Texas, just about 30 miles north of the heart of the hill country, Austin, Texas. I have been in my role for about 30 years, and I have previously served as the chairwoman of the Colleges That Change Lives Board of Directors. And it is through that connection that I have worked with this fantastic group of women previously. We're excited to present to you again today.
Thank you. Cathy, what about for you?
Sure, thank you. Cathy Finks. I'm currently serving as the interim vice president for enrollment here at the College of Wooster. You're going to hear a running theme, which is pretty unusual, but I've been at the College of Wooster for over 20 years, and so have seen lots of growth in lots of areas. My original background was in corporate finance, so big shift, but it does lead me to really strongly believe in transparency in financing, helping students be able to navigate that process. And all of us on this call are connected to the College of Change Lives. I'm a former board member as well, and really believe in access and fit. And so I'm happy to be here today.
Thank you. Lauren, how about yourself?
Hi, everybody. My name is Lauren Sefton. I'm Director of International Admission at Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee. And I did put in the chat, home of blues and rock and roll and barbecue. So happy to talk about some favorite Memphis restaurants. I have also been at Rhodes for over 20 years in their admission office, and I work with domestic and international students and have served on the board of Colleges That Change Lives as well.
Great, thank you. And Anne, what about for you?
Hi, everybody. Anne Marano, Executive Director at the Colleges That Change Lives organization. Prior to that, I spent the greater part of 30 years as a school-based college counselor, very committed to a student-centered philosophy of college admission counseling. So transitioning over to CTCL when I had the opportunity to do so was pretty natural. We are very, very aligned and couldn't be more excited to be in a space and in conversation again with this particular group of world changers who are extraordinary and the best of the best. So thanks everybody for being here, and thanks Cyndy for bringing us together one more time.
Well, thank you. It really is an opportunity to bring us all together and talk about from both sides of the desk. Our topic today, we want to talk about providing that support beyond graduation. I know many people have contact with their students after they graduate. I know sometimes that relationship ends maybe in May or after they graduate, but it shouldn't. And that's part of the message I want to share today. How can we help students provide that support from beyond graduation? And as they go on to college, we're going to talk about mental health and transition, talk about skill gaps. Not all our students are as prepared coming from high school to college. And we're also going to talk about, just kind of a roadmap from matriculation. But we want to start with some data so that we have a foundation. This whole slide presentation, we did this at both the HECA and the IECA conference. This slide presentation will be part of the show notes on my website afterwards. So we're not going to go through all the slides, but we want to start with some data so that you have that information. So you should be seeing on your screen a slide that talks about mental health and transition, and Lauren's going to share some thoughts with you on this.
Thanks, Cyndy. In the interest of having leaving plenty of time for really robust conversation, we're going to really quickly do an overview of the first couple of slides. So that we can just lay some groundwork and that you have some data as you're kind of moving forward in your progress. Because I think when we came together with this session topic, two things kept rising to the forefront of our conversation about how we can best equip our students to thrive in that college setting, in the independent setting. But you'd be remiss to have that kind of conversation if you don't acknowledge that mental health is a big piece of it and has become a bigger topic of conversation for young people and certainly on college campuses. So these first couple of slides, I think we can actually just kind of skip through, Christine, because you'll have access to this particular information along the way. But I'd love to go to, let's go right to this one. This is my favorite one because I think this relates to exactly what we're talking about with this particular cohort. This is a slide that was a joint report through ZME and Ruffalo Noel Levitz. It was a survey administered in March of 2023, so relatively recently. They surveyed 10,821 students who were in 12th grade at the time. So that was the class of 2023. And they surveyed them between October of 2022 and July of 2023 via the ZME app. So that was their particular audience. But I think it's really important to think about, and I would imagine, and you can put it in the chat if anything comes up as a surprise, but I suspect a lot of this is not a surprise for you when you're talking with your students about what they're nervous about. A lot of it is social anxiety, the idea of peer pressure and having a roommate and finding friends and fitting in. And so much of that, I think, is some of that has always been the case. But a lot of that is reminiscent of COVID and the pandemic and those social expectations that the social gaps that we're still learning. Of course, they're also thinking about grades and academics, and then finances, I think, are on the forefront of a lot of families' minds, and that's continuing to trickle down to not just something that parents are thinking about, but students are thinking about as well. But interestingly, the flip side of that, the things they're most excited about are also socially related. The meeting the new friends, and they're finding themselves and being independent and trying new places and new things and new atmospheres. So it's both sides of the coin. We're incredibly nervous and stressed about it, but we're also really excited about that. And so hopefully some of the things we talk about today can help us alleviate some of those stressors, but also help us feel like students can really lean into that excitement. And then this next slide is something that was run. It was a survey run on the Rhodes campus by our Student Success and Transitions team. It was a visual that was created in a workshop that was led by our Rhodes staff when we asked our students, at the time it was students who were opting into executive functioning skills, but also workshops on engaging and transitioning to college, organizational time management, and help. And we asked, what are the threats to seeking help? Why do you think students are not taking advantage of those resources that are available on campuses? And so it's important to point out that seeking help can oftentimes come with some negative feelings or associations, as you can see with that. So we really wanted to, on all of our campuses, acknowledge that seeking help is a skill that's developed over time. And so the earlier we can start thinking about that skill set on the high school level and then transitioning into college, the more you practice at it, the better you're going to get. So with that, I'm going to pass it back over to Cyndy to talk a little bit about how can we help students transition successfully.
Thanks, Lauren. I think that's where, coming off of what you just said, that's what we can do as counselors, is look at this and start asking those questions. What skills do our students need? What do they have? How can we nurture them, help them be able to be prepared and grow and take that leap? It is scary, and they suffer. I'm glad you pointed out both the social, sometimes it's more of the social than the academic. They worry about those other things, but the social becomes very prominent for them. And one of the other points too is that just because a student has excelled in high school does not necessarily mean they're as prepared for college as that transition. Self-advocacy, what are those tools that has mom and dad always help them get up in the morning or remind them to do homework? Are they able to handle that themselves? I know I've interviewed several of my students to talk about this with them. And then what are the systemic and social challenges? So those are things that we can do as counselors. And I want to have a conversation about those barriers to help that students have, just as that slide that you shared from the college side. When we talk to students, we try to tell them, go make sure you know where the mental health support is, how do you get appointments, but there's so much more to what the students need once they transition. So what are some of those barriers that your students tell you that they face, and then what can be done to reduce those barriers? So Lauren, let's start with you and then we'll just go around. How does that sound? So what are some of the barriers to help for students and what can be done to reduce those?
Sure. So our panel today is all small residential schools that are focused on that undergraduate experience. And so everything that's set up on campus is set up to help our students, our undergraduate students, not just succeed, but truly thrive. And so I think you'll find that all of us talk about the support services on campus because it's a natural part of our community. Our staff and our faculty are on our campuses because they want to work with undergraduate students. And so we all work across campus departments to help support students, where professors are engaged. They know their students well enough to know when something seems off, and they'll reach out through text message and through email, and they'll reach out to Residence Life and ask for a kind of almost like a welfare check on students. And so there's a lot of cross conversation between coaches and residence assistants and advisors and academic support advisors and professors and staff who take care of students. And so it's hard to fall through the cracks at a place like any of our schools because we're so focused on students on the personal level. But it still creates barriers in that we can offer all sorts of workshops and we can offer outreach and we can go knock on doors and we can put eyes on a student and say, let's talk about this, let's figure it out together. But in the same way, that original slide, there's still a lot of stigma, especially I think for our high achieving students who are not used to asking for help. And so trying to help students understand that it's not shameful. It's not embarrassing. It's not, it's something we're all going through. And so let's reach out and actually take advantage of these resources. But a lot of times our academic success team talks about this paralysis, that the students are so used to striving for perfection that the tiniest misstep creates this paralysis that just digs the hole further and further and further, and then they're not able to dig themselves out of it, even with all the support that's trying to be leveraged. So that would be that barrier, that idea of perfection and that fear of making a mistake, and not owning that making mistakes as part of the learning process.
Absolutely. And that actually connects to the Friday Forum we had last week, and Jed Appleruth talked about the mental anxiety that a lot of students experience and what that looks like and how to help manage that. So Cathy, what about from your perspective? What would you add to that?
Yeah, I was going to add a comment though, when you're talking about the level of anxiety, and then that great slide that Lauren showed about what are they anxious about. I was fortunate enough a couple of weeks ago to spend a week at Harvard with enrollment leaders from across the world. And one of the things we looked at actually was a current study that a professor is doing that looked at students from 30 years ago and 40 years ago who are experiencing some of these very same things that we talked about. And so I think what is great in terms of that presence is that, yes, we know there might be an increase, and there's lots of data about how social media is changing anxiety levels, right? But some of the root of what's then now coming up, because we're aware of this, we're talking about it, is that we can then put strategies and things in place, which is amazing. So thank you, Lauren, for that slide. I just wanted to kind of point that out. That's great. I think from our standpoint, one of the things that comes up from our care team that Lauren was talking about, from our professors, is there's sometimes a barrier about the lack of, they call it surface surfing, right? So students are willing to initially kind of, where should I go? What's my next step with the problem? And they might look initially, if they don't find it fast enough, they don't find the right answer quickly enough, they just stop, right? They're like, I don't know. And so it's that teaching that skill set of being intentional, being a critical thinker. What are you looking for? What are you trying to find? And not everything is going to be immediately at your fingertips. And so that's one of the barriers that we see. It's something that we're working on in our career development. It's something that our arts team that's working on. It's a matter of, not just handing students answers, but in classes, but talking to them like, well, what's your next step? So it's not something that's easily solved, but that in terms of a barrier, Cyndy, that's something that we see initially, and that's a whole range of students. That's high achieving students, that's students in the middle, because of their way of life and their culture and how things are presented so quickly to them, that becomes a barrier that we often run into.
Yeah. Interesting, because recently I was introduced to the concept of human-centered design. And it's recognizing that, yes, we will say, and we as counselors, I hear this all the time. Well, my students should be doing their assignments. My students should be doing X, Y, Z. Yes, they should, but they're human and we need to meet them where they are rather than say they should do this or that. And those were conversations we'd actually have when I was running a technology company. Well, they could find it ABC. It's no big deal. It's all there. But you have to meet them where they're at. So that makes a lot of sense. Christine, what about from your perspective? What is your...
I'm gonna back the barrier up a little bit. There are mixed thoughts about owning challenges and mental health issues, even in the college admission process. I think that there are many who say that that's a stigma. If you admit to having struggled through something, that it's going to be a black mark next to your name. One of the data points that we have seen, and part of what you'll see in the comprehensive presentation, is that several of our schools will track what students tell us in their application, in the application review process. And that's not the black mark, but it's the introduction to the student services side of our partnership, to be able to let others know Lauren had a death in the family. She has probably struggled with this in a mental health capacity. We might want to keep an eye out on Lauren in the fall of her freshman year as she's making these transitions. And so I think what this has all caused our institutions to do, and we are smaller and fit oriented and student oriented, so we're able to do it a whole lot easier than the big institutions, is to be able to say, we're going to kind of watch over these students and we're going to make sure, not that we're going to knock on their door and say, hey, Lauren, you wrote about in your essay that your father died. We're really sorry to hear that. What do we need to do for you? But if all of a sudden Lauren's not going to class, we now maybe have an understanding of why she may not be going to class. Maybe she really, there was dad's birthday came along and she really struggled with that key date in his passing. So what I think we have become is, instead of being siloed, it has forced us to become a really comprehensive flow of information to serve our students well and to be student-centered. And it starts with the information that they share. We did a 5-year study of the students that conveyed information to us, either in their admission interview, their application, their essay. And those aren't the kids that wound up on the care team list. Those aren't the students that wound up having difficulty because they had kind of reached the top of the mountain of the challenge, and they were now coming back down and were comfortable in talking about it and addressing it with the member of the admission team. I think where one of the barriers is, and we talked about the stigma in the very beginning with some of the data you saw, I got caught smoking pot on campus. I don't want to tell anybody about that because it's a really embarrassing mistake. But then when they get caught smoking pot on the college campus, we're not able to guide them through that journey. Yes, part of growing in college is the social aspect as well as the academic aspect. And so when we know at schools like ours, we're able to provide resources, connections. Sometimes they're subtle. Sometimes they're a lot more in your face. But we want to make sure that student realizes that a mental health challenge, a physical health challenge, a choice that they made when they were 15 and they were being dumb is not a limitation or an indication that they won't be successful in this next part of the journey. And so I am a proponent of sharing those life lessons with us and share with us how you learned through them, if it is an appropriate space for you. It's not an appropriate space for everybody, and that's okay. But we can help make connections when we know. We aren't in that capacity when we have no clue. And then the student is having to reach out on their own with their comfort level. And as we've all talked about, sometimes that's a harder thing for them to do, especially if they're far away from home, especially if they're navigating asking for help for the first time.
Absolutely. And that is the key. And sometimes students aren't used to asking for that help. They need to be given that skill and encouraged to do that. So Anne, what are some things, strategies or approaches that you have found that help students overcome those kinds of barriers?
And I love what everybody shared so far. And it reminds me of, and I don't know if we're still using this topic or this the way to describe the student-centered services, but intrusive intervention, right? So getting in front of students before there's an issue and we have that flexibility and capacity at schools like the CTCLs because that's how we were designed. But getting in front of students and making sure they understand what resources are available, taking advantage of peer mentoring programs is another thing. But when I was, a couple of things I thought of that the students I had the privilege of working with struggled with was campus culture. So navigating systems that weren't necessarily built for them. And I'm thinking of students who may come from backgrounds that are not overly reflected in the community they find themselves in for their undergraduate experience, communicating with professors, because that's very different than communicating with a teacher in middle or high school. Money management, right? If you are for the first time in your life handling your own debit card or your own credit card, or you get a credit card because they gave you a t-shirt and a coupon for pizza, and so you sign up for the credit card. Allegedly, this didn't happen to anybody we know in this session right now in the early 90s, and then got yourself into debt, but then your parents co-sign, and then it's a whole thing. Like we could talk about that offline. So sometimes, yeah, running out of your money too soon. I love that Christine talked about, there are decisions that students make that are developmentally appropriate that aren't always the best choices, but they are life lessons, and how to navigate the fallout from that, or picking yourself up from that, realizing that that one thing, that one decision, that one choice that you made does not define you for the rest of your life. And that you don't need to walk or carry that shame, that you can grow from that experience. A lot of the things I did when I was on the secondary side, we simulated situations that were common for first year students to go through. So we did a whole week of transition to college programming, and I had the ability to do that because I had a manageable, senior class and a lot of support from the school, and brought in outside experts. And we leaned very heavily on our alumni to share their experience. It was real talk, shut the doors. Is this being recorded? Anyway, it was real talk, so that the students who had already walked that walk could say, this is what happened. This is what I tried. This is what worked well. This is what didn't work so well. They could really speak to the self-advocacy thing. Like, look, everybody, because nobody, the peer-to-peer information or support or advice goes a lot farther sometimes, I found in my practice, than when I say it. I'm a little older, a little further removed from their experience. But when, somebody from the adjacent generation says, or is just a few years older than you, says, look, there's no shame in the game of asking for help. There are people on campus who are just waiting for you, and you're not going to ask them a question they haven't heard before. And if you do ask them a question they haven't heard before, that's great, because you're going to help them learn too. As a practitioner, somebody working in student affairs. But yeah, we would walk through, okay, I had a game. I can share it to everybody later, Cyndy, how to do it. But we would just introduce scenarios, things that could typically happen, and then where would you go? What would you do? So it was like, if your roommate has a lost weekend, or you lose your roommate at a party and they come home later and they are hungover or sick or upset, what do you do? Who are the people on campus that you can talk to? What's a resident assistant? What do you do when there's a loss in your family, or you're needed at home and you can't get there because maybe financially you don't have the resources to jump on a plane, or just the timing is too much because of the things you have going on at school? How do you find a roommate? How do you manage your time? What happens if you have all these assignments due at the same time and you're managing your work study or your internship experience? How do you talk to professors? We would role play. What are office hours? That's the other thing, right? Breaking down the lingo, because we use this whole other language in higher ed. I don't care what your background is. And well, I do care what your background is. What I'm saying is, it doesn't discriminate, right? That not understanding the language that we use sometimes, the shorthand. And so providing access to information about those things, a glossary, can be very helpful for students from all kinds of backgrounds, even from families that have a lot of college experience. It's still kind of new. I think we think that once students are admitted and they make that decision, and we throw up the confetti and we have the big celebrations, that they've just got it all figured out. And I think that we unnecessarily burden, particularly students who are high achieving, thinking that they know the system better than students who aren't. It's like, no, it's an equal opportunity challenge. Sorry, I know I went in a lot of directions there, but I'm pretty passionate about this topic because it doesn't stop. That guidance follows them all the way through that first and sometimes second and third year, depending. I think being really aware of the separation anxiety, and that when the honeymoon period is over, the first month of school, when everybody's signing up for clubs and organizations and they're going to games and they're just getting really caught up in the campus culture and feeling a part of that community. And then the reality sets in, and right around Halloween or the beginning of November is when that first major meltdown might happen. We used to teach our students and their families to be aware of that and to set themselves up for success before that. Get to know the counselors in the counseling office before you find yourself in a moment of crisis. Go introduce yourself to the different supports on campus. Do some self-reflection to understand where you might have growth areas and take advantage of that stuff. And the last thing I'll say, I'm sorry, is we also had all of our students obviously participate in orientation but we did an exercise where they had a map of their campus. I printed out a physical map and a list of places they should identify and the people there they should get to know. And they filled out a spreadsheet that went with their map. A couple years, I put them on laminated cards for them. But it was just so that there wouldn't be a surprise when they got to campus. Oh, shoot, I'm having trouble in my math class. Where do I go? They had already done that research over the summer, and it made them feel a little more confident going into those spaces come the start of the fall term. And now I will mute.
Thank you, Anne. Well, you packed a lot into that and lots of good suggestions. And that's why we're having this conversation today, because transition is on both sides. And in my practice for years, have said my services go through the freshman year of college for all those reasons. And I've already had very intimate conversations with parents of my students just this week. And they're like, we're so glad we still have you so that we can ask these questions and find that support. Finding those services, managing the roommate situation. For years, I would recommend students start in the summer if they could, because then they're, especially on a larger campus, because they're in a much smaller environment, then they do get to know the campus. So when everybody shows up in the fall, then they're more oriented. So there are little tips and things that we can do as counselors, also with our partners at the colleges, that can make a difference. So looks like we have a question. Carmen, go ahead.
Yes, so I appreciate you all acknowledging how different the focus on the undergrad philosophy on student-centeredness and that approach of supporting students can be different from institution to institution. So how would you advise how counselors can work with families to balance the influence of prestige when it comes to picking a university? Because we know that some of the most highly ranked institutions are not focused on this student-centered approach that you mentioned, so that we can make sure we're meeting and fully recognize the needs of undergrads.
So how do we get them off of just looking at the highly selective schools?
I think one thing that you can do is, if you have a family that has demonstrated some concerns about some of these topics that we've brought up today, mental health, academic learning style, physical needs, it is important to meet with those offices during the college search process themselves and to ascertain, does this office feel like they're going to be able to work with me and support me? Is this the support that I need? Not all of our offices are perfect, even at small schools like those featured here today. But I think sometimes, as the question was alluding to, the larger prestige-oriented schools, they will have that, but they may not serve well. And if that connection isn't there when I met with the learning disability specialist, when I met with the introduction to the mental health counselors, if they're not going to be able to meet my needs, does that make this institution as a whole not the best fit for me? Because we are balancing that academic and social. If they're on the struggle bus to the point that they fail, it doesn't matter that they're going to a sweatshirt college, because they won't be there for more than one semester or more than 1 year. And then that journey is going to have to begin again. There's nothing wrong with that failure. We hope to learn from it to make the second journey the right journey. But if we can also learn in front of the journey to make sure we're making those wise choices, I think that's really helpful as well. And there have been some great articles in both the New York Times and the Washington Post about some of those prestige colleges really struggling in student service related areas. I think it gets back to the assumption that high profile students don't need help. And often that is a very big fallacy that is uncovered in the first 6 to 8 weeks of school, when they're far away from home, when they aren't the top of the class like they were in high school, when they're surrounded by lots of really brilliant students. And then there's some question, can I do this? Am I worthy? This just doesn't feel good. And the spirals can sometimes begin. So I am a big proponent of going to those key offices of support, asking for an appointment, reading their websites, asking questions as a prospective family to gain that confidence along the way.
Any other thoughts or comments?
I mean, I think part of the question too is that, you know, we don't fault the system, right? There's so much frenzy around this and there's so much pressure. And really the bottom line is, you know, parents want the best thing for their students and students think they want the best things. But to that point, you know, sometimes they don't know what they don't know. And so, you know, just pointing out, have you done the research on, you know, maybe these two other schools you're suggesting that might be really more student-centered and a really great fit? What are their outcomes? We actually did a panel this spring on this very topic. I think it was at IACA, and we put, there's a slide up there where we put like outcomes and some notable things about, you know, how many go to Peace Corps, how many got Rhodes Scholars, how many got, you know, and then we didn't put who the school is initially. And then, you know, lo and behold, yes, there were some of the schools that you would think of. And then there was also these other amazingly fabulous schools where students are actually being educated and being taught how to think critically and going to be world changers and really truly finding themselves, but aren't always at the top of their tongue. And so anyways, I digress. But some of it is just helping them, narrowing down the list enough to maybe find those schools that you know are going to be good fits, and then really pushing them to look at some of those outcome pieces based on what they want, you know, based on who that student is and the survey data you're collecting. You know, what are those must-haves in a school? What are you looking for? What's that connectedness? Is it grad school? Is it, you know, being able to be an entrepreneur, like whatever it is for that student. And then back to surfacing, right? Like, you know, letting them dive in. And sometimes they come to this conclusion, oh, did you know? Yes, I did know that about that school, but I'm glad that you found it out. So, but it's not an easy switch, right? And that's part of the process. And that's why we love coming out and just talking and sometimes commiserating with each other about the process and about how it goes. So,
Lauren, what about from your perspective?
No, I agree. I think both Christine and Cathy brought up excellent points. And I think the key is to have the student and their family do that research. You can help as a counselor guide those questions and role play and guide it. But if the question is this school going to meet my needs where I am, the student has to understand that. And if it's really hard to find the information, to reach out to a person, to get a response, to set up a Zoom call, to have a conversation, to go in person on campus and meet with somebody, they need to experience that themselves so that they can determine can I put that kind of effort into this for 4 years? And the answer may very well be yes, but they need to experience that themselves. If mom does it for them, then that doesn't help the student over the course of 4 years.
That's very true. What about your experience, and as you've worked with students, how does that play out from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes to get parents or families on the same on the student-centered page is to really do a deep dive into what are their hopes for that child, right? Like what would you hope? How would you define that your child's had a successful undergraduate experience? So is it that they were admitted to grad school, that they found gainful employment and are not living with you past their 30th birthday? Are they, you know, finding work that's meaningful? Are they partnering up with someone that's going to love, that they love, that's going to love them back? Are they, committing themselves to interests that they find particularly fulfilling? All of those things. Are they at a certain income bracket? Blah, blah, blah. Because at the end of the day, I think most families really just want their students to find work that's meaningful, someone who loves them, someone they can love, and they can support themselves financially, right? Ultimately. But because of the hype and the frenzy and the narrative, forgive me, in this country that's obsessed with the same 15 schools, and the idea that you can't get there from here, which I think is popular, and it's a myth. It's hard for parents to get out of that. So it takes a little more thoughtful reflection to get to a space where it's like, all right, well, now that we've talked about what those outcomes look like, start with the outcomes data and then work your way backwards to where, maybe it's not backwards and forwards, to where the student is really taking a look at the kind of community I want to be a part of, and what are the students like there, and what is the campus vibe like, and how far do I want to stretch, and do I want to be somewhere that feels really homogeneous or somewhere that's really, really different. All of the things that you may already be asking them already, but from the lens of where am I going to feel comfortable and challenged and nurtured, and oh, by the way, they also have an excellent program in. I'm shameless, and I would, like Cathy was talking about the presentation that we did earlier this spring, but even in my own work, I'm shameless in pulling out all kinds of placement data, going right to institutional research and saying, okay, this is from these schools that I think, because I've worked with you and know you really well, these are schools that I'd love for you to look at. And by the way, check out what their students are doing in these certain departments, and or their internships, and or their graduate placements, and or their employability and that sort of thing. Because that can speak volumes. And if you have to compare that data to some of the 15 schools that everybody talks about that that family is really concerned with or focused on, do it, to shatter those myths, I think.
Mm-hmm. I think so too. Well, and one of the places that we really face this is with students coming from other countries or other cultures. So what are some things that are done to help that transition from another culture, another country? Is it different? Is it the same? What does that look like? Lauren, I know you're involved in international admissions, so let's start with you.
Sure. Yes. It's interesting because for some countries and cultures and backgrounds, the idea of asking for help or acknowledging that you need any sort of assistance is frowned upon. And so I think more and more college campuses are recognizing that there are cultural differences. And even that can be the case certainly for students who are first generation in the US as well. And so there seems to be a trend and more outreach to parents and caregivers to help them understand that these are opportunities for students to take advantage of on campus. For international students specifically, we all have international student services offices and that usually do different orientations. And some of that orientation is directly related to transitioning certainly to the US culture, but also here are things that are available to you that may not have been available to you in your home experience and home culture. And I always think that that's honestly, it's pretty exciting to see students kind of have their eyes open in a lot of ways about adjusting to college and adjusting to the US and having access to some of those support services. I think in some ways, especially for international students, they know moving to a new country is going to be such a huge transition on their own that mentally they've already kind of prepared themselves for that experience. And there's usually a built-in cohort of other international students and other international students on campus from previous years that kind of provide that support network. So in some ways, it's almost easier to make some of those adjustments, given those circumstances and again, level of community on campus, even at those larger campuses.
Good. Any other thoughts or programs or applications? Go ahead.
I think it was important to focus on the international population, knowing that many independent counselors work with students from outside the country. But let's all remember, when we think of cultural sometimes, let's also remember going from Southern California to Ohio could be a massive change for an individual. You're talking temperature, you're talking food, you're talking location. The ability to get back home on a regular basis may be different. And so some of that and setting them up for success is recognizing College of Wooster may be the most fantastic fit for you. You went and visited it in April when it was sunny and beautiful. Let's talk about what it's going to be like in January and February, where there's going to be some pretty massive snow and you don't have a thick coat or thick boots at all to potentially wear a part of this journey. If your whole life has been centered around cultural food and you go to a different part of the country, we were talking about Lauren and her barbecue. But if you're coming from a Latinx family and that has been your food community for a long time, and you go to a different part of the country or part of the world, and that's not available, it can be a real shock for some students. So when we talk about some of those changes, it isn't just an international student who's coming from a really far distance, but it can even be within our own country when we're talking about culture, when we're talking about change and climate. The ability for the kids that are local to drive home or to go home, and where international students and out-of-state students may get a trip at Christmas and not get another trip until the end of the year. Those things can be triggers for other mental and emotional health issues. And if we haven't talked about those as part of the journey, we're missing out on preparing them for success when they start and beyond.
Absolutely. I think that's an important thing. I think it brings us back to another question. I know as a counselor, first you think, oh, there's one office. And for years it was said, oh, well, the student transition is handled by the first year experience. That was the sum of the student transition. And now we know it's way more than that. But how many offices are responsible? Is it just one office, or is there a collective of offices on campus that are responsible? Cathy, we'll start with you.
And my internet has been going in and out, so if I fade out, somebody can just jump in. It is not one office. That would be nearly impossible in that poor office. I can only imagine how that would go, right? It's a whole collection of offices. And that is actually, when you go back, if you get the slide deck, if you go back and dig into this, we talk about this, right? And I think the beauty of our schools, and you can see this just in our conversation, is we've really worked intentionally to break down those silos. So right now I'm looking at a retention issue, or not an issue, a retention of a student, and it's the left hand and the right hand. Are they talking to each other, right? So this student didn't know that he had additional aid that was waiting. He just needed to fill out a form. And so if the business office isn't, this is one example, but if the business office isn't talking to the student support office, they're going to fall through the cracks. And so that plays out all over our campus all the time. We have these centered groups that talk, whether it's anything from the care teams that we were talking about, to retention pods, to you name it. When a school is there because the students are the center of who we are, it creates a very different dynamic, right? We're not there as this number one research school in X. We're there to serve the students, and that creates a whole different synergy, which is pretty amazing. And that's why I continue, and probably the same for Christine and Lauren, to work at a place like Wooster or Rhodes or Southwestern, because you get to be part of that change and that impact. Anyways, I digress. But one of the other things that would be important is, and Christine or Lauren can pick up on this, is that yes, there's set offices. It could be a writing center, it could be the learning center, it could be the peer advising center. Those are places to point students to, but you could also point students to things like, have you looked at the amount of student clubs that might support first gen or underrepresented? Have you looked at the religious office to see all the different student groups that are supported, and can you find support there? Can you find somebody that can lead you, do that peer-to-peer advising that Anne talked about? So it is definitely not just one place that oversees it, but once they're here, it's definitely not one place that we point them to. And I think, to Christine's point a moment ago, helping them navigate, helping them realize, helping them do the search before they get there on those offices can be really important.
Well, and I think there's been a little bit of Q&A on this, and at some previous groups we've also talked about this in presentations, but as counselors, follow Anne's direction of, like, look at the map and circle locations of places that might be helpful for you. Think about who are your go-to resources if you have a question about your bill, if you have a question about roommates, if you have a question about if you get a cold and you don't know who to go to for your first cold that you're living on your own, whatever it may be. Think of all these different scenarios and have your students write down who is the person, their name, their email address, their contact information, their physical location on campus. Have them circle it on the map so that they can envision, maybe do a role play conversation for some of those. But that way they have that they have that list of go-to people. So it's not completely foreign. You've helped them do some of that research. That is what Cathy talked about at the very beginning. You're not just skimming the surface and saying, oh, there's an office for that. No, who is in that office? How do you actually reach out to them? Where do you physically go to have a conversation, or how do you set up a Zoom appointment or whatever it may be, and actually go through the steps with them. One of our participants when we did this presentation live talked about having all of her students do a photo scavenger hunt as part of, they arrive on campus and they had to send the pictures of themselves in certain places around campus to her before the holiday break. And then they got, I don't know, a Starbucks gift card or something to follow up with that. So make them go through the steps of not just that surface level, oh, those things exist, but how do I actually take advantage of them? And how do I find my people on campus, the offices, but also just who's the staff person or the professor that you have just found as a mentor? Who's the person that works in the cafeteria that makes you chocolate chip pancakes every Monday, Wednesday, Friday because you have an 8 a.m. class and that's what you do and that's what you look forward to, and that's your person. That's great. Find those people.
Hey, Lauren, to that very point, I had a first year in college this year, my own daughter, and hers was, I think her name was Jane or Anne, I can't remember, but she was the omelet person. So, and if Jane was there, she was making her omelets and that was her person. And when she got home, she's like, I just miss her omelets. And she talked to her every morning, right? As a swimmer who was up at 5:30. So those people are really important, Lauren.
Yeah, they really are. And what is your perspective or experience been?
I wish I would have had an omelet person. That's amazing. That's like the best thing I've heard all week. I think it's a great thing to ask students to reflect on their secondary experience and think about the kind of support that they have found helpful throughout that time. And then would they like to continue with that level of support and or grow? I get the biggest, I think I've already shared the biggest piece of advice in terms of getting support. And that actually came from my spouse, who's a faculty professor, and tells her first year students, when you get to campus, or even during orientation, but when you get to campus, go introduce yourselves to some of the centers that you all have already named, but particularly counseling services. And she's at a larger institution, so that you make your presence known. You can start to kind of do soft interviews with the folks that are working there, see if you feel a vibe. So that when you need to see one, and there's nothing wrong with getting just like regular support, because we could all use an objective third party to talk to. But when you find yourself really needing that support, it may be easier for you to get an appointment, because sometimes it takes 4 to 6 to, no, I don't know. I was going to say 4 to 6 weeks sometimes to get on the counseling roster, depending on the level of support or how the office is staffed, that sort of thing. And that was one of the best things I ever heard, and I would tell students that. From the initial search process, I guess it's good to know right up front. I want to thank Christine for using that learn in front of the journey. That's genius, and I'm going to steal that. I'm thinking particularly in this moment of like LGBTQ plus kids. Kids have been historically marginalized, or first gen, or students from limited income backgrounds, to identify if there are EOP programs on campus, educational opportunity programs, or services that are specifically identifying them or focused on them. And that can be tough depending on what part of the country you're in and what your state is doing around diversity equity initiatives. But I guess also, let's not forget, I just popped into my head. Let's give a shout out to like your admissions counselor.
Yes.
All of them. They are not all created equal, and they sometimes are called admissions recruiters, and they're not admissions counselors. And that's a whole different thing about territory management and how big the school is. But at most places, or I should say it depends. But if you have established a relationship with your admissions counselor, they can be an unbelievable source of information to connect with people on campus. Exactly. And particularly if you don't know what you don't know, right? Is to say, who are the people I should get to know on campus? And I know on all of our campuses and schools like ours, I'm sure that there are people that your admissions counselor would say, you should go see Dr. Donovan. You know, maybe he's over in student affairs. Maybe Dr. Donovan is in the athletics office. Who knows? But like maybe he's got just a special way with first year students or knows, you know, has been there the longest and can, you know, direct a student to different things. I don't know. I just think I forgot that we should probably give our admissions colleagues a shout out because especially this group, because
Yes.
who's going to know a campus better than 20, 30, I've lost track, 80? No, more than that. I was an English major. Like almost 100 collective years of experience with their institutions, right? Like who's going to know?
Is that a good thing to say out loud, Anne?
Yes.
You're aging us all, Anne.
We can edit that out in post, right? Anyway.
Well, I think that's a point well taken, that those relationships don't end when you transition. And parents need to remember that as well too, because they are, yeah, we can still call them. Our students still have those emails, and or then if they're on campus, they can actually reach out. So that can make a big difference. I want to go back to, we just have a few more minutes. It's amazing how fast this time goes by. This is such an important topic for all of us. We want to hand off our students to the colleges in a good, have them well prepared. And the scavenger hunt, I love the things you talked about. And that's why transition has always been a big part of what I teach in UCLA and everything else. And Peter Van Buskirk talks about this. I'll be interviewing him soon for UCLA interview series. Also, Harlan Cohen, he's all about transition. He's the author of The Naked Roommate. I've interviewed him, and he talks about the 3 things the students need as they get ready to transition. And we've talked about all of them today. That's people, places, and patience. You know, find those people that you can go to where they're your people, and the places where you can go that are going to give you the tools and support that you need. And they may not be the places that you think they're going to be, but identifying them and then having patience. It is a transition. You are going to get homesick. You're going to, the tests and exams. High school or college is not a 13th year of high school. We've talked about that in other forums as well. So those are important aspects to consider. So that's all things that, and it's exciting to be able to know that we can partner with you. Counselors can partner with colleges and find all these different resources and share those with families as well. So I see we just have a couple of minutes left. I want to turn the time back over to Anne so we can talk about the colleges that change lives. I saw there was a question about why these certain colleges are CTCL. So if you could address that and give everybody an opportunity to see where they can come in the summer to learn more about CTCL schools. So Anne.
Yeah, thank you. We are excited to be traveling for our 26th year, which is thrilling. And so this summer we find ourselves in 13 cities. It's kind of like a rock concert schedule. These events offer an information session that will talk about how to do a student-centered college admission search, the value of the liberal arts and sciences, introduce folks to the CTCL member institutions, and we do a little myth busting around things that we hear all the time that may not always be true as students move through this process. And that information session is followed by a college fair featuring the member institutions of CTCL. The events are open and free to the public. We encourage pre-registration, and we'd love to see students, families, and those that advise them, including IECs, school-based counselors, folks that are affiliated with community-based organizations, and other college access professionals. So please join us on the road and introduce yourself, because I will be at all of them. And so it'd be great to meet you. CTCL is a nonprofit organization that was incorporated in 2006, inspired by the work and vision and message of Lauren Pope, who first uplifted 40 colleges that change lives with his seminal work, a book of the same name, The Colleges That Change Lives, in 1996. Any of the schools that were named across 4 editions of the book were invited to join the organization that is now also called the Colleges That Change Lives. We currently stand at 43 member institutions. We're all liberal arts and sciences institutions, average enrollment of about 1,500. We are 43 schools across 24 states. Real commitment to the liberal arts and sciences. I keep saying that because the sciences never left the liberal arts. Hi. Can I get a little cheer for that? Holistic admission review, really focused on residential communities and faculty who teach, and schools that really offer students from all different levels of academic backgrounds and preparation access to high impact educational experiences. The question in the Q&A today asked, well, why just 40? That seems like an arbitrary number. And if we pause the recording, I did not have the privilege of meeting or working directly with Lauren. I have a suspicion through research that I've done with Hillary Mazel Oswald, the editor of the 4th edition, that it was a publishing decision to have a nice round number. But also that was something that Lauren had arrived at. Lauren was one of the first independent educational consultants in this country, kind of a Renaissance man, and he'd been in practice for many, many years advising students and families, and wanted to put into writing out there this concept of a student-centered search to push back against the hype and frenzy in college admissions, and to really amplify the good work that was being done at schools that were lesser known. And they were lesser known not because they weren't fabulous, not because they weren't launching undergraduates into greatness, but because it's a crowded space for the 15 schools that dominate the narrative. So Lauren, that's what motivated him. And subsequent decisions, schools that came off the list, went onto the list. It was really a publishing decision that had to do with refreshing and juicing up the brand. And we could talk more about that later. But the board is constantly having conversations about whether or not expansion makes sense and what that might look like. So stay tuned. I can't promise you anything, but stay tuned. And just for the sake of all the legal things that have been shared with me, we have no rights to the book. We do not own rights to the book as an organization, but we exist with the blessing of Lauren Pope and his family. But we can't, there probably won't be a 5th edition of the book unless we write it. And if we did, we'd violate copyright. So we have to come up with another idea.
Yeah.
Somebody mute me with 3 former board directors in this call.
Thanks, Anne. And it's so good to know about the CTCL, the history behind it, the book that kind of launched this, but how the concept, like many other things, has grown and expanded beyond that. I will tell you, I've also interviewed Edward Fisk on the Fisk Guide, another real popular college guide, and that question comes up, like, why are these colleges in the Fisk Guide? And his answer is the same thing. It's a journalistic decision in terms of which schools go in and which ones don't. So that's all part of it. And that is something for us to remember as counselors as well. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. Thanks especially to my special guests, Christine, Cathy, and Lauren, and Carmen. Thanks for helping to make all of this happen. I hope all of you will join me again. The next Friday Forum will be in August. We are going to do a back to school special, have a Friday Forum every Friday in August. We're going to talk about AI for counselors, AI for us as a counseling profession, also from a business perspective. We're going to talk about all sorts of great things in August. So be watching for emails. And then also I am posting interviews that I'm doing on my website. They also go onto my YouTube channel. So if you haven't subscribed to my YouTube channel, just subscribe to Cyndy McDonald's channel. Make it very easy. Just remember my name's spelled with 2 Y's, not an I. So there's no I in Cyndy in my name. And I hope you'll all join me again. And safe travels, Christine, Cathy, and Lauren. And thank you, everyone, for being here today.